Hello and welcome to By the Book. This is your host, Joe Hebert. Today we continue our series on truth, justice, and leadership with a study of Machiavelli's Prince. Today we'll be delving into chapters 19 through 21, but first a brief recap of what we've seen earlier in the book. From the beginning, we see that Machiavelli is studying and teaching us about the actions of great men. By greatness, he means the maximization of acquisition, and especially the acquisition of empire and glory. And he's going to teach us how to do that. In doing so, is his first lesson and his main focus throughout the book is on the obstacle that morality poses to acquisition, the need to do immoral things like betraying one's allies in order to consolidate power. Also, the obstacle that's posed by the church as an independent organization that not only teaches the wrongness of such things, but which is also competing for power and influence with the prince. And so these are ongoing themes in his book. And we see that the strategy that Machiavelli is recommending here for power consolidation will include making an alliance with the people, because this is convenient because the people simply want to be left alone and not oppressed. And one's competitors for power can always be accused of being enemies of the people because they want to command and oppress the people. So the prince will have to be the defender of the people. And this is not because he loves them or because he wants to do what's good, but because this is the best formula for gaining power. If the people support you, then others will fear to oppose you. And this means that the strategy for consolidating power will be to accuse anyone or any other institution or group that opposes one or competes with one as being enemies of the people. And this will include the church. Machiavelli's goal with the church is to not to eliminate religion or belief, but rather to subordinate it to political authority and to ensure that it is promoting the interests of the prince or the state. We then see that Machiavelli starts turning to the philosophical questions. His own philosophical positions have been clear, that he thinks human nature is about acquisition, that morality is not something to worry about, etc. But in chapter 15, he acknowledges that he is going against the teachings of others, and he gives a kind of response, which is not so much a debate with those philosophers as more of a strategic exploration of how does one relate to them. Because on the one hand, these traditional virtues and vices that have been taught in classical ethics as well as theology are things that the people appreciate and will always appreciate, at least at a superficial level. So it's important to pretend to have them. We have to know enough about traditional virtue to pretend to have it. But since we also need to violate it on a regular basis, we need to have excuses for doing that. We need to know how to justify this. So this is a section of the Prince where Machiavelli is sort of blending his own idea of virtue, which is whatever it takes to succeed, with traditional ideas of virtue, which have a different basis, which we'll be studying in more depth later in the course. And he is showing how to appear to have the one while actually doing the other, and how to make excuses for that discrepancy. And in doing this, we see that the key virtues and vices that he's concerned about are, on the one hand, generosity or liberality, versus stinginess or parsimony. And here, his key advice is that to have a reputation of generosity would ruin you, because it would require a display of giving away all kinds of things. But on the other hand, if one is not taking from the people, one is allowing them to have their property, their security, their enjoyments, then over time one can have the reputation of being generous by not taking. On the other hand, if there's an opportunity to take from others, from enemies, and then give that to your people, then that's an opportunity you can seize. And then the other one is with cruelty or mercy. And here again, Machiavelli stresses you don't want to be hated because if you're unnecessarily taking things from people or hurting people, they'll become desperate to come after you. You don't want to make yourself hated, but you have to be feared. And you do, of course, have to eliminate enemies. But from the people as a whole, you want to be feared, but not hated. And you can do this by showing that when you do eliminate enemies and when you do use force, you're doing this for the protection of the people to maintain law and order. And so your cruelty is actually a kind of mercy. Your surgical or targeted cruelty is, in the big picture, is helping everyone. So as we move further in the Prince, and we're starting to get towards the end of the book, Machiavelli has a lot of different different balls in the air here. He has his own basic philosophical theory. He has the historical circumstances of his time that he's grappling with, and he has this question of how to relate to the classical teachings and virtues, and how going forward to readapt and reinterpret those things in a way that's going to fit his own thinking. And in the next few chapters, we'll see how he continues to juggle, these different pieces here, and how he's advising us after his death in the generations that follow, how to actually implement these ideas that he's bringing up in the book. So chapter 19 is of avoiding contempt and hatred. And so this is, of particular significance to Machiavelli because, as we've seen, you need to have control over people, and you want them to fear you, but you don't want them to hate you because that would make them desperate and do desperate things. And we've seen his distinction between the people and the great. That distinction it's fairly simple, and it sounds like a simple solution. You support the people against the great because the people are more numerous, the people aren't competing with you, the people are easier to please, basically, and yet by aligning yourself with the people, you can then be in a position to handle the great. So that's his formula. But as we get into these final chapters of the book, Machiavelli, looking forward and realizing the people who implement this are going to be running into various different circumstances. That things are always changing and moving in political affairs. His book, if it's going to have continued relevance, can't just be stuck in his own time period of the way things are. He's got to be thinking forward. And so we see him looking forward and back in these final chapters, looking back to the Romans, as he always does, and also looking at some more current events and sort of projecting a little bit where this is going to go. Now, one thing about the people in the great distinction is that those who are sufficiently great, that is, those who have enough ambition that they are competitors, need to be eliminated, as we've seen. But one cannot literally eliminate everyone who has ambitions within a society. One reason for this is simply that even if we're talking about a prince who's a monarch, he can't single-handedly rule and do everything himself. He needs to have an apparatus of rule. He needs to have ministers and people who do things. Also, not only for bare logistical reasons does he need that, but as we've seen before, it's often highly useful to get other people to do your dirty work, and so they take the blame for the things that are not popular. And that's another reason that even a prince is going to need a governmental apparatus and need people. Like, what's going to motivate these people? They have to have their own ambitions that motivate them to actually be part of the government and do this kind of dirty work in the first place. So they're not exactly going to be the people. They're not going to be those who just want to be left alone. But they're not so great that they are really competitors with you. There's somewhere in between, the moderately great, so to speak. Well, how do you deal with them on an ongoing basis? Like, we have Ramiro de Orco as an example of Cesare Borgia, puts him in charge and then has him cut in half. That's a very brutal kind of tactic. Do you want to be doing that all the time? Well, here Machiavelli gives us a contemporary example from France, and it's an example of an institution which could be done on a regular, ongoing basis, which has a similar dynamic, and there's a similar strategy, at least the way he interprets this. And that's the French Parliament. We're not talking about a parliament in the sense of a legislature. The French Parliament was a court, and so it's part of a legal apparatus, a judicial system. So we've said before, Machiavelli is like the Socratic thinkers we're going to look at later. Machiavelli is also in favor of the rule of law. But the logic of law for Machiavelli, as we've seen, is different from the classical logic. In classical logic, law is a way of ensuring justice and of encouraging virtue in a classical sense. But for Machiavelli, law is just another means of force. But it's more convenient, especially, there are moments when you have to be physically violent, but you want to establish law and order. And if you're successful, you want to have, order and peace for the most part, but you still have to have that sort of threat of force. So courts for Machiavelli are kind of a weapon. They're almost like a perfect weapon because it's a way of keeping people in fear, keeping people in line, but it looks really good. And as he says here about the French Parliament, in particular, he thinks that the French kings set this up because they wanted to keep the great in line. They wanted to keep the nobility, the ambitious people in line, but they didn't want to personally intervene and punish these people from time to time, and always look bad and always have other great people suspicious of them and so forth. So they set up a court system that would do that for them. And then, the judges, it becomes their job to rein those people in. And if anybody gets the hatred, it's going to be the judges. But meanwhile, the kings get the advantage of reining in the nobility. And notice how Machiavelli talks about the hatred that the generality of the people have for these people. So you get to satisfy the people by punishing those greats, but you don't personally get the hatred of those greats for doing that because you've farmed it out to someone else. And the judges, of course, are going to have to be people who have enough ambition that they are willing to play that role and they take some kind of satisfaction in enforcing the law on people, but they're not so ambitious that they're going to be trying to take over the government. The next example that we're looking at here from this chapter, it's another nuance that Machiavelli is bringing in here. So he's had the people and the great, but here he introduces another category, which is the military. And he's talking about in relation to Roman emperors. Rome, we have to realize, was a military republic. So it's the basis of Rome's power and its status and empire was military conquest. So the military was very significant, but the military poses a certain challenge. For the prince to be powerful or the state to be powerful, it has to have a successful military against foreign enemies, and for internal order, a government has to be able to to put soldiers and police and so forth into action. But again, these are people who, they're not just going to be the regular everyday people. They're people with higher levels of ambition and fierceness and things like that. And so they can get out of control. And in this case, Machiavelli talks about how the Roman armies would sometimes just want to rob the people. And so this is a tricky thing. It's the kind of thing that's going to be an ongoing challenge. Even though Machiavelli is giving us some formulas in this book that he thinks will revolutionize the world, and as we have seen and will see, he's talking about conquering fortune. If we do this right, it's going to really consolidate power in an airtight kind of way. But there remain challenges, and there always will be challenges. There always will be a need for prudent leadership in the Machiavellian formula, just like there is in the classical formula. This is one of the similarities that we're going to see between Machiavelli and classical thinkers. It's just a different kind of prudence for Machiavelli. It's a strictly pragmatic prudence of how do you keep people in line, and how do you prevent things from falling apart. But this keeping a lid on the military, keeping it strong enough to achieve one's goals without allowing it to run amok and in this case, disturb the prince's relationship to the people, is going to require ongoing strategic thinking. So in this passage, we see Machiavelli making a couple of comments. So how does one keep, soldiers in line without losing military force? And he makes a distinction about between the Roman times and our own times for the most part. And this is one of the rare cases where the advantage is with the contemporary paradigm, because he says for the Romans there was an entrenchment of that military into the government in such a way that it was extremely dangerous for the government not to satisfy the soldiers, because the government was intertwined so much with the military. So he's suggesting it's helpful, as in modern Europe, to have more of a separation between the military and the government. So they're not entangled to the point where the government is frozen if it's not keeping the soldiers happy. From here, though, Machiavelli does something interesting. He turns to Egypt and he talks about the Sultan of Egypt. And he says, but there, like with the Romans, there's this entanglement of the military and the government, and that poses a problem. But then he comes and brings it back to Europe, but he says it's like the Christian pontificate. So in other words, it's like the Catholic Church and the papacy. But how is it like that? We've already seen that the church, by and large, doesn't have its own soldiers. Literally, that's part of why it's driven not only the church but others who imitate the church to hire mercenaries, because the church doesn't do its own fighting. So this is more of a metaphorical reference. What does he mean by the soldiers of the Christian pontificate, the military of the Christian pontificate? And it seems that he's referring to the priesthood, basically, right? If you think about it in the structure of the church, you have the Pope, you have the cardinals, and we've seen those prominently discussed by Machiavelli. But then under them, you have the bishops and the priests. And that takes you all the way down to the local parish level of how the church governs and operates around the world. So if we're thinking about conquering the church or taking control of it, co-opting it into the political system, then at this point, Machiavelli, again, he's gone from the top levels and he's now kind of looking at the system as a whole. It's kind of like a military operation. If you look at all the priests who are out there, they're not a majority of the population, but like an army, they're sort of like the active agents that keep the thing going. And from a spiritual point of view, there's the church militant on earth, and they're sort of in charge of that. But from Machiavelli's point of view, it's that struggle to control people's beliefs, and if you want to take that over, it's like taking over a military. So just like if you think about today, the way that we define these things in the United States, for example, with the military, we have civilian control over the military. And in religion, we have a separation of church and state, but the boundaries there are governed by the state. So for us, for example, the Supreme Court of the United States is going to make final decisions about, the establishment of religion, the free exercise of religion, and things like that. So I think both of those are, indicative of what Machiavelli is getting at in this chapter, is that you want to have some kind of system where there's enough of a separation between the government and the military and the church, but then the government is able to keep the military and the church in line in the sense of doing the things that will be supportive of that governmental authority, but not letting them get out of control and ultimately turn against the government and apply counter pressures or movements, stir up movements against them. So in chapter 20, Machiavelli talks about whether fortresses and many other things which are made and done by princes every day are useful or useless. And again, there's a wide variety of examples and a wide variety of possibilities and strategies that he looks at here. We're going to try to keep this simple in this intro course, so we're not slogging through all of these points the way that we could in a more in-depth study. And I just want to comment that, again, I think part of what he's doing with these final chapters, he is acknowledging a sort of greater complexity to things than some of the simpler formulas that he gave earlier. It's not because he's abandoning those formulas. It's simply because he is showing that to implement them is going to require ongoing prudential calculations in amidst the complexities of life. And he's trying to look ahead to what some of those things are. In this case, there are questions about both internally, the different factions within a society and the risks that there could be conspiracies within a society to unseat a prince or to stage a coup, regime change. And then, of course, there's the external enemies. And those can be invading, or one can be invading them. So there's quite a few different combinations of things that can go on. Now, fortresses, we already saw that fortresses are both a literal reality of warfare in that time period, but also a good metaphor for the attitude that Machiavelli is promoting, that he wants the prince to have this strong alliance with the people and then against his enemies. So the ideal is that you either physically are, behind walls with your people and the enemies outside, or metaphorically, you've got some kind of sense that we're on this side, the prince and the people, and anybody else that we're dealing with is outside metaphorically. We can easily paint them as being an enemy, and we can respond in that kind of way. Now, for this reason, when it comes to the strategies for dealing with internal opposition and external opposition, Machiavelli ultimately reiterates in this chapter, amidst the various scenarios that can happen, that you basically want all the arms, and we see now that this could include actual armies, soldiers with weapons, but also this would include say like the priesthood or whoever is going to be in charge of religion or belief system. You want all of them to be yours. So you have to insist upon unity among the people, among the military, among the clerics, the church. There has to be a strong sense of unity among all of them. And divisions, any kind of divided loyalty has to be excluded. Divisions can be used as a weapon against other societies. So if you want to weaken another society, you could try to encourage divisions within that society and weaken it. But as soon as you're trying to incorporate it into your own, you would have to establish some kind of unity, right? Because you don't want to take on any divided, populations and try to govern over them, because that will fall apart. So this is a crucial distinction. You can sow division, but only externally, so to speak, against others. If you end up incorporating them into your own state, then you have to bring them within that unity. And one of the tools for this that he mentions here, and this is just a variation on what we've seen before, but is in the context, is a crucial maneuver that you would have to master in different contexts of figuring out, one way to unite people is to have a common enemy. So if you need to establish or maintain this unity, there's a kind of perpetual need to be able to find the convenient enemies that you need to unite your people and hold them together. So there's an ongoing need to have enemies, in a sense, is part of what he's getting at here. And just to confirm that this idea of a fortress is both literal and metaphorical, Machiavelli comes out here and he tells us that the best fortress is not to be hated by the people. So this is really the ultimate lesson that he's teaching and reiterating here, is that if you have the people on your side, the people do not hate you, especially important, then you are well positioned to deal with enemies. And that is always, and we'll see in all the complexities that Machiavelli wrestles with in the last chapters of his book, he's always coming back to that point. you're founding on the people, so that is your foundation, and that's what you're always going back to in all different difficulties that may arise at any stage of the process. So finally, for today, we have chapter 21, what a prince should do to be held in esteem. And I think this chapter starts to get really interesting in certain ways. Because up until now, Machiavelli has certainly, his positive goal has been accumulating power, but his recommendations have been, in a sense, quite negative or modest. You eliminate enemies, so that's not modest, but that's very negative, right? You're eliminating competition. And then on a positive note, you remain, you ally yourself to the people, and you make sure the people don't hate you and the people don't feel threatened by you. But he now gets into, if you've got that down, he says, well, the next step is actually you want to be held in esteem. You want to be admired by the people. So he's bringing a more positive element. And as he does this, he's going to reintroduce some things that he appeared to just completely ignore. And you almost would think that they have no role in his society. Like, for example, we're going to see education and the arts and things like that are going to come in. You would have almost had the impression that he just doesn't care about these things because as far as laws and beliefs and religion, it's only there to make people obey. That's all it's there for. So the search for truth and beauty and all these kinds of things just seems to be completely brushed aside by Machiavelli. But now he's going to bring them back in, just like he sort of brought in classical philosophy, but he said not the way they understood it. It's just going to be a facade, but it's still an important facade. Now he's going to do something like that with you could say culture in general. But before he gets there, there still is a kind of his first example of how you gain esteem and admiration is a little more characteristic of what he had talked about before. One thing that's unusual, however, is that whereas previously his contemporary examples are all failures, sooner or later they fail. So even though he agrees with their ambitions, but he finds their methods were not virtuous enough, and they did not succeed at acquiring what they desired. But here's a contemporary example that Machiavelli brings in who is successful. And as we'll see, there's maybe a little question about what exactly does Machiavelli think about him. But we have to appreciate the fact that this man is successful in Machiavelli's view, and that we're learning something here about how to succeed in Machiavelli's own time period. And then moving forward, this is something that we could build on if we're trying to implement Machiavelli's ideas. And so he brings up Ferdinand of Aragon, the present king of Spain. This man can be called an almost new prince because from being a weak king, he has become, by fame and glory, the first king among the Christians. So this is very important because Machiavelli has generally characterized Europe in his time as being weak. Pretty much all the princes, all the rulers in contemporary Europe are weak, and a big part of it is because of Christianity, and his view has interfered with power consolidation. So this is a major exception. Somebody who went from being weak to being strong, and he's among the Christians. As we're going to see, Christianity had a big part to do with how he achieved that. And so Machiavelli is going to come back at this point in the Prince and look at a positive example of how you could use Christianity to consolidate power. And so let's take a look at that. So first, a brief note on who we're talking about here, Ferdinand of Aragon, or Ferdinand the Catholic, as he's sometimes called. And he ruled Aragon from 1479 to 1516. And he is famous for a number of accomplishments. And in a nutshell, he is, as Machiavelli implies, consolidating power in Spain through a variety of means. One of them was by marriage. So his marriage to Isabella was important, of Castile, but also through warfare, And in particular, on the religious front, he is famous for the Reconquista, which was driving the Muslims out of the peninsula, and so moving towards a religious unification of the peninsula under the Catholic faith, as well as the political dynastic unification of the peninsula under his kingship and heirs. So he's one of the important historical figures in what we could look at as a development of the nation state, of Spain becoming a unified nation. But Machiavelli is looking at him as an example of how kings in his own time period could use the dynamics of the existing order to their advantage to move things in that direction. So as with all the different things Machiavelli brings up in this part of the Prince, there's a certain complexity to it. But let's take a brief look at some of the things that Ferdinand was doing that Machiavelli admires. For one thing, there were these different kingdoms in what we now call Spain. And so he has to make a distinction, for example, between his own armies and the armies that are allied to him or under his control to some extent, but they're not exactly his own. And part of the way that he does that, Machiavelli says, is by having these armies being preoccupied with battles and things that he's sending them to, so they can't really think about conspiring against him while he's building up his own army and establishing an independent power base that's going to be more loyal to him. And in doing this also, how is he going to afford doing it? He's shrewd at getting not only the people to pay for it, and Machiavelli is going to say you got to be careful about that because you don't want to drain the people. Their main reason for wanting to obey you is so they can enjoy their property. You want to overdo that. But the church, because there's a religious element to this, we are driving out the infidels. So the church has to kick in for that. He gets the church to help to pay for this. And in Machiavelli's view, his motive is he wants to establish his own power, but he can use the religious dynamic to help accomplish that. And he gets somebody else to pay for his exploits. That is a really crucial tactic that Machiavelli has already recommended, and he shows it in practice here. He says he's always making use of religion. And this is where it gets particularly interesting, where Machiavelli says that in expelling, the Marranos, these were Muslims and Jews who had converted to Christianity, perhaps for political, social reasons, and who were regarded with suspicion. Are they truly Christian? Are they truly loyal? And his response to the situation is to expel them, to just drive them all out. There has to be no ambiguity that everybody is one of us, everybody is unified in this kingdom. Okay, so what does Machiavelli think about that? He calls it an act of pious cruelty. This is a very famous phrase from Machiavelli's Prince, pious cruelty, for him to do that. And he says, nor could there be an example more wretched and rarer than this. So it's deeply ambiguous praise. And I want to talk about that for a minute, because the way that Machiavelli praises this has led some to raise, the possibility that it's actually not a praise. It's actually a criticism. He's being ironic. And in that vein, what we might see here is that Machiavelli is saying, okay, from his own point of view, perhaps this is the best that you could make out of Christianity. You could use Christianity as a way of consolidating power by demanding this kind of religious, purity and unity. And this is what Ferdinand is doing in Machiavelli's view. He's using that demand for religious unity as a way of establishing rock-solid control over the population in his territory. But by calling it cruel as well as pious, Machiavelli is insinuating that maybe it works and maybe it's an okay way to do that, but maybe there's a better way in the long run. Maybe there's a less cruel way of doing this. In other words, maybe in the future we'll be able to leave religion behind, we'll be able to water it down further, And there will be other methods of uniting people that don't require this harsh distinction between the believer and the unbeliever, which can lead to drastic things like what Ferdinand did. There's a sort of an admirable excellence to this in the way that he was virtuous enough to make this all work. But on the other hand, there's a kind of wretchedness to this. Do we really have to resort to such tactics, or could there be something better? So, in one of the influences that Machiavelli has had on the world, what I would say is that kind of mentality, the secularist mentality that says that with the weakening of religion in society, with the advent of a more secular mindset, we can actually reduce the violence and the conflict and the tension that religion brings into the world. And think about John Lennon singing about how we can have a world with no religion, and it's going to be this, peaceful, wonderful thing. And so I would say that this is one way you could look at Machiavelli's insinuations here, and one way that you could formulate a kind of Machiavellian hope that maybe with the displacement of religion can lead to a more peaceful world. But also bear in mind that as Machiavelli has already taught us, that the only thing that matters is success at acquiring power and maintaining power. And that although there is a kind of cruelty to this and wretchedness to this, but it's highly successful, and it's successful not just in some immediate short-term sense, like Agathocles, taking power and then dying, and everybody says, "Oh, the tyrant's gone." But this is somebody who Machiavelli is giving an example of somebody who did gain great admiration for himself. In other words, he won glory, and certainly we can see in retrospect that this is in fact building, the kind of a future that Machiavelli wants. It is laying the foundations for what becomes one of the great nation states. It's hard to see on Machiavellian grounds exactly what would be wrong with this. It may not be the absolute, ideal for Machiavelli. He certainly could have preference for something that he thinks would be better than this, but it does seem like, from his own criteria, this is the kind of thing that you want to do. And just one further comment on that. The very nature of what Machiavelli is arguing here is that if you want this kind of admiration, you have to have great exploits. And as we've already seen, great exploits involve unifying the people, but the only way to unify the people is to have enemies. So when does this ever get to the point of something like world peace, for example? In a certain sense, world peace could be understood as a Machiavellian aspiration, because you want the prince and the people and eliminate the great. And if you did that at a global level, you eventually get to the point where there's global peace, because you have this global prince, whatever that would look like, and the global population can be peaceful and content. So yeah, I think that's, there's a certain Machiavellianism to that concept. But at the same time, how do you maintain unity? How would you control a global principality? You would still have to have some kind of enforcement. You would have to have military and so forth. Well, how do you keep them happy? Machiavelli, by this point, has made it clear that to make all this work, you have to have battles, you have to have enemies, you have to have struggles going on, so that you can distract the right people and keep the right people busy with the right things to maintain the balance. So if we fast forward to, say, like the 20th century, for example, where the nation state has become established, and the Machiavellian logic has become sort of normalized, you see kind of both of these strains. You see various different points in the 20th century where we think we can have world peace, or at least mostly world, like large scale peace and prosperity. But at the same time, we end up with these world wars and cold wars and things like that. And in some of these cases, these are the bloodiest conflicts in human history, the most destructive in various ways, whether it's militarily, the amount of military destruction going on and lives lost in battle, or whether it's attacking of civilian populations with nuclear weapons or carpet bombing or whatever, or you look at the concentration camps and the death camps and stuff that are used in totalitarian regimes. No matter how you look at it, the way of achieving these great hopes of peace and that require these systems that would impose this on us actually led to conflicts and destruction on the most massive scale. And I think we can see both of these things, the threads of both of them, really in Machiavelli's Prince. And just to follow up on that a little bit, here is a paragraph from this chapter where Machiavelli emphasizes the point: there's never going to be a period of rest. There always is going to be conflict and danger. And the princes who ever think that they can just rest and they've achieved what they can and just enjoy that are the ones that will fall on ruin. And the princes in the states, they're always looking for the next battle and the next conflict, and they are on top of that. They're the ones who have the prudence, the kind of prudence that Machiavelli is trying to teach in this book. So finally, I want to look at this paragraph where Machiavelli talks about the arts and things of that nature. He actually comes out and says a prince should also show himself a lover of the virtues, giving recognition to virtuous men. This is interesting in various ways. First of all, in the classical tradition, one of the classical critiques of the tyrant, what's so bad about tyranny, is that tyrants are afraid of virtue. Because tyrants are bad rulers, the virtuous would oppose them. They see the virtuous as a threat, and so they're trying to suppress virtue. But the purpose of society in classical thought is to promote virtue. So it becomes a vicious circle because the tyrants aren't ruling well. They're opposed by virtuous men. Therefore, they want to suppress virtue, and they become even worse rulers. And there's a kind of destructive spiral there that goes on in tyranny. And this is something that, in a sense, we could accuse Machiavelli of, because he has gone so far not only as opposing classical virtue, but of telling us that it's phony, that it doesn't really exist, and he's replacing it with a virtue which is all about power consolidation. So in Machiavelli's view, if there were somebody who claimed to possess classical virtue, which he technically argues doesn't really exist, that person would easily be labeled as an enemy of the people, as we have seen, and would have to be eliminated, because this would be one of the people who would try to find out the truth about the prince and try to tell the truth about the prince, and that would be a threat. And he's already said those kinds of people you have to label as enemies of the people and eliminate them. So I think Machiavelli is guilty of that classical, fault of a tyrant of wanting to eliminate virtue. But remember, he redefined virtue in terms of power acquisition. And in this paragraph, I think he's doing another twist on virtue. So this isn't the virtue of the prince. This is the virtue of the people. And previously it said the people are decent. They want to be left alone. They're decent in a selfish kind of way. So this too is going to be a selfish kind of virtue, but it's going to be a decently selfish kind of virtue. It's the kind of decent, selfish virtue that the general population can practice. And well, virtue means excellence. So what kind of excellence is going to be, like low level selfish excellence? Well, what is that? Basically, it's going to be things like he's looking at the arts again, but he's looking at them not as a matter of finding what is true, good, and beautiful, but as a matter of making life more comfortable and enjoyable. So he wants the quiet kind of virtues and excellence in agriculture and in other pursuits in the crafts. So people are not afraid of trying to make things work better, make things easier to use, make things more pleasant to use, make them more, beautiful in a simple kind of way, just more enjoyable and pleasant. In fact, the prince should be rewarding people who do that. Because remember, his formula is he keeps the people on his side, keeps the people obedient because they get to have their property and enjoy their pleasures in life. So anybody who can make life more comfortable, more convenient, and more pleasant is, in a sense, reinforcing the power of the prince. He's upping the value of that carrot that the prince is holding out. If you obey me, you can enjoy these things. Well, the more things there are to enjoy, then the better offer that is. So this is a very important part of Machiavelli's legacy. He shows how you can follow what, in a certain sense, is this kind of classical tyrannical logic, but instead of falling into the trap of the classical tyrant who is suppressing virtue completely, you need to suppress classical virtue, definitely, but you need to come up with a new definition of virtue that you can promote so you do not look tyrannical, first of all. It takes away that appearance of tyranny. But second, because those kinds of virtue, the redefined virtue that are adorning the practical life of the people, are only going to reinforce the willingness of the people to obey you.